Roxane Cohen Silver is a social health psychologist in collective trauma and how people can cope with it. She is the Distinguished Professor of Psychology, Medicine, and Public Health and the Vice Provost of Institutional Research, Assessment, and Planning at the University of California, Irvine. Thank you so much for being with us. Can you talk to us a little bit about this? How does this affect people psychologically, specifically viewing these violent events over and over again on social media?
One thing that I can say quite clearly, and first, thank you for having me. One thing that I can say quite clearly is that there is no psychological benefit to exposure to graphic, gruesome images of violence. And repeated exposure to these graphic images can be even more potent than just seeing something once.
So explain that, the repeated exposure compared to, say, you see an event, maybe you even witness something in person. Why is that so different when someone is watching it over and over? And I will just use as an example that I was on X yesterday, and in my feed populated a snippet of the Charlie Kirk shooting over and over repeatedly. I had to scroll off it, but before I could, I think I saw it 3 different times, and I was not seeking out that content. Why is it specifically that repetition, and how does that work?
Well, when you are at an event, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. When you are seeing something looping over and over again via media, it is almost as if there's no stop. It just continues over and over again. And that seems to be psychologically, it has some psychological consequences. We see that with increased and repeated exposure to these kinds of images, one has flashbacks, anxiety, distress, maybe nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping. And we see very clearly in research that my colleagues and I have conducted over the past 20 years that the kinds of images that people are seeing now are far more graphic and gruesome than they were before. Moreover, decades ago, we only were exposed to these kinds of images on television. Maybe you heard about the stories on radio, print media. And at that time, there were editors who were monitoring what we saw. But now with social media and what used to be called user-generated content, this is content that somebody may be filming on their phone. People are distributing this content without thinking about the potential psychological consequences for the recipient.
And what's the impact of political polarization on the mental health of Americans?
Well, it's very clear right now that political polarization is leading to increased stress. My colleagues and I have been studying the kinds of stressors that have been upsetting people, certainly since the beginning of the pandemic. And in fact, political polarization was one of the most stressful experiences reported by a nationally representative sample. We know that this political polarization is leading to social conflict, even within a family or within a social network. And we know that people are seeing these kinds of graphic images and the kinds of stories that you were describing. It's all bad news all the time. And the political polarization, I believe, is only making it worse.
So, Professor, how can people cope with this?
Well, my recommendation is that people monitor the amount of time that they are spending engaged with bad news in social media, in witnessing graphic images. I think people should be very conscious about the amount of time that they're spending. I personally have not seen the videos. I am avoiding quite deliberately, not the news, but the graphic and gruesome images. And I think it's very, very important that people pay attention to how much time they are spending. People can engage in doom scrolling where they click on one bad story and then the next and the next. And it's very difficult to extricate oneself from that. But it's very important that we pay attention to how much time we are spending, and we do our best to not click on these graphic images.
Yeah, it helps when you outline the stakes as you just have. Roxane Cohen Silver, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.